The morning of October 25th, 1944, 420 miles east of Samar Island, Captain Wilder Baker stood on the bridge of USS Lexington, CV-16, and watched something that should have been impossible. His flight deck crew was launching aircraft at a rate that violated every assumption Japanese naval planners had made about carrier operations. 73 seconds. That's how long it took for the first aircraft to clear the deck after launch commenced. Another aircraft followed 12 seconds later, then another, and another. The pattern continued with mechanical precision. Hellcat fighters roared down the flight deck at intervals that would have seemed reckless 2 years earlier. Dive bombers followed, their wings barely missing each other as they taxied into position. Torpedo bombers, heavy with ordnance, rolled forward the instant space cleared ahead of them. Baker had seen this choreography executed dozens of times since Lexington's commissioning in February 1943. What never ceased to amaze him was the speed. In 7 minutes, 98 aircraft would be airborne from his ship alone. Across Task Force 38, 15 Essex-class and light carriers were conducting similar launches simultaneously. Within 20 minutes, over 400 aircraft would be climbing towards strike altitude, formed into coordinated attack groups, heading west toward the Japanese fleet. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the Japanese center force steaming through the Sibuyan Sea that same morning, operated under calculations developed by the Imperial Japanese Navy's most experienced carrier officers. Those calculations held that a fleet carrier required approximately 45 minutes to launch a full deck load of aircraft. Japanese doctrine assumed that American carriers, built quickly by a nation the Japanese had dismissed as industrially inefficient, would perform no better than Japanese vessels. This assumption was catastrophically wrong. The Essex-class carriers weren't just faster at launching aircraft. They represented a complete reimagining of what a carrier could be and how carrier aviation could be conducted at industrial scale. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how Essex-class carriers achieved launch rates that Japanese admirals never anticipated began not with naval architects, but with production engineers who understood something fundamental about American industrial strength. Mass production didn't mean identical copies of existing designs. It meant standardization that allowed continuous improvement and unprecedented operational tempo. Japanese carriers in 1944 remained magnificent vessels, built according to doctrines established in the 1920s and 30s. Each carrier was essentially unique, designed and constructed, with minimal standardization between ships. Shokaku and Zuikaku, Japan's finest carriers, had been built to different internal layouts despite being sister ships. Modifications made during one ship's construction weren't automatically incorporated into the other. This approach worked brilliantly when Japan operated a small number of carriers with hand-picked crews, trained specifically for each vessel. It failed catastrophically when the war demanded rapid replacement of losses, quick training of new crews, and continuous operational deployment that left no time for individual ship optimization. The United States Navy had learned different lessons from the interwar years. American naval architects studied carrier operations with the clinical detachment of efficiency experts analyzing factory production lines. They asked questions Japanese designers never considered. How could aircraft handling be accelerated? How could maintenance be conducted without removing aircraft from the hangar? How could ordnance loading proceed simultaneously with refueling? How could damage control systems protect the ship without restricting flight operations? The answers shaped every aspect of Essex-class design. The ships weren't just larger than previous American carriers. They were fundamentally different machines optimized for sustained high-tempo operations. USS Essex, CV-9, commissioned December 31st, 1942, was the first of what would become the largest class of fleet carriers ever built. 24 ships would be completed. 8 more would be cancelled after the Japanese surrender. The program represented American industrial planning at its most ambitious. William Francis Gibbs, the naval architect who refined the Essex design, understood that building 24 near-identical ships created opportunities impossible with unique vessels. Every improvement discovered during construction of early ships could be immediately incorporated into later vessels. Every operational lesson learned by crews on deployed carriers could be translated into design modifications for ships still under construction. The feedback loop between fleet operations and shipyard production operated at speeds that Japanese shipbuilding, with its emphasis on custom construction, simply could not match. The Essex-class carriers measured 872 feet in length. Standard displacement was 27,100 tons. Full load displacement reached 33,900 tons, but these numbers understated the real achievement. The ships were designed from the keel up to launch and recover aircraft faster than any carrier afloat. The flight deck stretched 862 feet, wider than previous American carriers, with a deck edge elevator that allowed aircraft movement without interrupting flight operations. Earlier, American carriers had centerline elevators that blocked the flight deck whenever aircraft moved, between hangar and deck. Essex-class carriers could simultaneously launch aircraft while elevators brought replacements from the hangar below. This seemingly minor design detail had profound operational implications. Japanese carriers conducting a launch needed to clear the flight deck of all parked aircraft before launching could begin. This required spotting aircraft in precise positions, which took time. If additional aircraft needed to come up from the hangar during launch operations, the entire process stopped while the elevator rose through the flight deck. Essex-class carriers eliminated this constraint. The deck edge elevator could deliver aircraft from the hangar while launches continued at the bow. Flight deck crews could maintain continuous operations without the starts and stops that plagued less efficiently designed ships. The hangar deck measured 538 feet by 70 feet, with a clear height of 17.5 feet. This space could accommodate approximately 40 aircraft if packed efficiently. The flight deck could hold another 60 aircraft when spotted for maximum capacity. Total aircraft complement varied depending on mission requirements, but typically ranged from 80 to 108 aircraft. Japanese fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, by comparison, carried 70 to 84 aircraft depending on type mix. The numerical advantage alone was significant, but more important was how quickly Essex-class carriers could put those aircraft into the air. Flight deck operations on an Essex-class carrier followed choreography developed through systematic testing and refined through combat experience. The system worked because it was designed as a system, not as a collection of individual procedures. Aircraft spotted on the flight deck were positioned in launch order. Fighters went first, positioned at the bow with wings folded. Behind them sat dive bombers. At the stern, torpedo bombers waited, with wings extended because their folding mechanisms required more time to lock for flight. This positioning meant that as aircraft launched from the bow, crews at the stern could be conducting final checks on aircraft that wouldn't launch for several more minutes. Ordnance crews worked underneath parked aircraft, loading bombs and torpedoes, while pilots conducted pre-flight checks above them. Fuel hoses snaked across the deck to multiple aircraft simultaneously. Essex-class carriers had multiple fueling stations built into the flight deck, allowing parallel operations that Japanese carriers conducting sequential fueling could never match. The deck crew itself was organized with industrial precision. Each crew member wore color-coded jerseys indicating their function. Plane directors wore yellow. Ordnance crews wore red. Fueling crews wore purple. Arresting gear crews wore green. Mechanics wore blue. Fire crews wore white with red stripes. This color coding, developed early in the war, allowed anyone on the deck to instantly identify who was responsible for each function. Communication proceeded through standardized hand signals, visible across the flight deck noise and prop wash that made verbal commands useless beyond a few feet. Directors positioned themselves where they could see both the pilot and the deck space ahead. Their signals were absolute. A pilot might be a veteran with hundreds of combat hours, but on the flight deck, He followed the director's commands without question. The launch itself began with fighters. The air boss, controlling operations from primary flight control high in the island superstructure, gave the signal to start engines. Fighters at the bow fired up first. The sound was tremendous. 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines producing 2,000 horsepower, each roared to life in sequence. The deck vibrated. Prop wash from the forward aircraft blasted back across the deck, requiring crews behind to brace against the hurricane-force wind. The first fighter received launch clearance. The pilot advanced throttle to full power, while the deck crew held the aircraft in place with wheel chocks. When engine temperature and oil pressure reached acceptable levels, the deck director signaled for chock removal. The fighter surged forward, accelerating down the deck. At approximately 70 knots, it reached flying speed and lifted off. The entire process, from engine start to wheels up, took approximately 90 seconds for the first aircraft. The second fighter was already rolling forward before the first cleared the bow. 12 seconds later, it launched. The pattern continued. Fighter after fighter roared down the deck at intervals that left no margin for error. If an aircraft developed mechanical problems during its launch roll, disaster could result as following aircraft had no space to abort. This was where crew training proved decisive. Mechanics conducting pre-flight checks identified problems before launch began. Pilots conducted disciplined engine run-ups that revealed issues while aircraft were still parked. The goal was 0 aborts once launch sequence started. Essex-class carriers achieved this goal with remarkable consistency. Behind the launching fighters, dive bombers moved forward to take their positions. Their launch tempo was slightly slower because they were heavier and required longer takeoff rolls. But the process continued without pause. As soon as the last fighter cleared, the first dive bomber accelerated down the deck. Torpedo bombers came last. These were the heaviest aircraft, carrying Mark 13 torpedoes weighing over 2,000 pounds each, plus fuel for extended range. Their launch required the carrier to turn into the wind and increase speed to maximum, adding the carrier's forward motion to the aircraft's takeoff speed. But even these heavy aircraft launched at intervals measured in seconds, not minutes. The entire launch proceeded, with assembly line efficiency. 7 minutes after the first aircraft rolled, 98 aircraft were airborne. They circled above the carrier in designated holding patterns, forming up by squadron before departing for their targets. The carrier immediately began recovery operations for the combat air patrol that had been aloft during the launch, then prepared for the next launch cycle. Japanese carrier doctrine, developed in an era when carriers operated individually or in small groups, never anticipated this tempo. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, who had commanded Carrier Division 2 at Midway before going down with his flagship Hiryu, had been considered one of Japan's most innovative carrier tacticians. His estimate for launching a full strike from a fleet carrier was 40 to 45 minutes. This timing assumed excellent crew performance and no complications. Yamaguchi's calculations were not wrong for the carriers he commanded. Japanese carriers required sequential operations that American parallel processing eliminated. Fuel trucks had to complete fueling before ordnance loading began because the flight deck couldn't safely accommodate both operations simultaneously. Aircraft had to be precisely spotted because centerline elevators blocked deck movement. Warm-up and pre-flight checks proceeded methodically because Japanese maintenance doctrine emphasized thorough procedures over speed. The result was that even Japan's best carriers required at least 35 to 40 minutes to launch a full strike. This timing was acceptable when Japanese carriers operated against opponents with similar constraints. It became fatal when they faced Essex-class carriers launching in 7 minutes. The mathematical implications were profound. In the time a Japanese carrier launched one strike, an Essex-class carrier could launch and recover, then launch again. This advantage compounded across an entire task force. Task Force 38, operating with 12 Essex-class carriers, could put over 1,000 aircraft into the air in less time than a Japanese carrier force could launch 200. The tempo advantage also meant American carriers could maintain continuous operations. Launch a strike, recover combat air patrol. Launch replacement combat air patrol. Recover scouts. Launch another strike. The cycle continued throughout daylight hours without the extended pauses Japanese carriers needed between operations. Admiral William Halsey, commanding 3rd Fleet from his flagship USS New Jersey, understood the operational implications of Essex-class launch capabilities better than any officer in the Pacific. Halsey had witnessed the evolution of American carrier doctrine from the desperate days of 1942, when every carrier was precious and losses irreplaceable, through the industrial surge of 1943, when Essex-class carriers began arriving in numbers that changed the mathematics of naval warfare. By October 1944, Halsey commanded a force that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. Task Force 38 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher included 17 carriers, 6 battleships, 17 cruisers, and 64 destroyers. This force could launch over 1,000 aircraft in a single strike. It could maintain continuous combat air patrol over its own formations while simultaneously conducting offensive operations hundreds of miles away. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Japanese Combined Fleet, by contrast, operated with constraints that made victory mathematically impossible. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, steaming toward Leyte Gulf on October 24th, included 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 13 destroyers. Absent were carriers. Not because Japanese doctrine had abandoned carrier aviation, but because Japan no longer possessed trained air crews capable of operating from carriers effectively. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force included 4 carriers with a total of 116 aircraft, but these carriers served primarily as decoys, deliberately sacrificing themselves to draw American attention away from Kurita's battleships. The strategy acknowledged brutal reality. Japanese carriers could no longer function as offensive weapons because the pilots who might have flown from them were dead, and the training infrastructure that might have replaced them had collapsed. The contrast illustrated how completely the nature of naval warfare had shifted. In 1942, carriers were precious assets protected by screening forces and deployed cautiously. By late 1944, American carriers operated with aggressive confidence born of overwhelming superiority. Japanese carriers, once the elite strike arm of the Imperial Navy, were reduced to expendable bait. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would demonstrate Essex-class capabilities under combat conditions that tested every aspect of their design. On October 24th, search aircraft from Task Force 38 located Kurita's center force in the Sibuyan Sea. Admiral Sherman's Task Group 38.3, built around carriers Essex, Lexington, and Princeton, immediately launched strikes. The launch proceeded with the precision of repeated practice. At 08:15 hours, the first aircraft lifted from Essex's deck. 7 minutes later, 96 aircraft were airborne and forming up. Lexington launched 73 aircraft in 6 minutes. Princeton, a light carrier with smaller capacity, launched 32 aircraft in 4 minutes. Within 20 minutes, 201 aircraft were climbing toward attack altitude. They found Kurita's force at approximately 10:30 hours. The battleship Musashi, sister ship to Yamato, and the second-largest battleship ever built, became primary target. What followed was methodical destruction spread across 7 hours of continuous attacks. Essex-class carriers didn't just launch the initial strike. They recovered returning aircraft, refueled and rearmed them, and launched again and again and again. 5 separate strikes hit Kurita's force throughout October 24th. Each strike consisted of dozens of aircraft launching from multiple carriers within minutes of each other, coordinating their attacks to overwhelm Japanese defenses. Musashi absorbed an estimated 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits before capsizing and sinking at 19:35 hours. Over 1,000 crew members went down with her. The battleship's death was not the result of a single devastating blow, but of continuous attrition that Japanese damage control could not contain. The ability to conduct this sustained assault depended entirely on Essex-class launch and recovery capabilities. Each carrier completed a cycle of launch, recovery, rearm, and relaunch in approximately 90 minutes. Japanese carriers, requiring 45 minutes just to launch, could never have maintained this tempo. The contrast became even more stark on October 25th during the Battle off Samar. Kurita's center force, having survived the Sibuyan Sea attacks, emerged from San Bernardino Strait at dawn and encountered Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's Task Unit 77.4.3, call sign Taffy 3. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The escort carriers were Kaiser-class vessels built on merchant hulls, small and slow compared to Essex-class fleet carriers. Each carried approximately 28 aircraft. They were designed for anti-submarine patrol and close air support, not fleet action against battleships. Kurita's force included 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. In a surface engagement, the disparity was overwhelming. Yamato's 18-inch guns could destroy an escort carrier with a single salvo. The escort carrier's 5-inch guns were useless against battleship armor. Sprague's only advantage was aircraft. His 6 escort carriers together held approximately 170 aircraft. If he could get them airborne before Kurita's battleships closed to gun range, his aircraft might inflict enough damage to drive off the Japanese force. The escort carriers began launching at 0658 hours under desperate circumstances. Japanese shells were already falling around the formation. Yamato's opening salvo landed close enough that colored dye markers in the shells stained the ocean red, yellow, and green, allowing Japanese spotters to distinguish which battleship's shells landed where. The escort carriers launched everything. Fighters that had been armed for close air support against ground targets launched with whatever ordnance was already loaded. Some aircraft carried general-purpose bombs useless against armored warships. Others carried depth charges intended for submarines. Some fighters launched with nothing but ammunition for their 50-caliber machine guns because there was no time to load bombs. The launch proceeded in chaos that would have been impossible from an Essex-class carrier's organized flight deck. Aircraft took off while the carriers maneuvered radically to avoid incoming shells. Flight deck crews worked while Japanese shells landed close enough to drench them with seawater. Yet within 15 minutes, all 6 carriers had launched everything that could fly. What saved Taffy 3 was not the ordnance their aircraft carried, but the continuous presence of aircraft over the Japanese formation. Pilots made repeated attack runs even after expending all weapons, because the act of diving toward Japanese ships forced them to maneuver and disrupted their gunnery. Japanese anti-aircraft fire claimed several aircraft, but couldn't stop the swarm of attackers that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. Admiral Kurita, watching this desperate defense, made a decision that would haunt Japanese naval history. At 0920 hours, with victory seemingly within reach, he ordered a general withdrawal. His reasoning was never entirely clear. Some historians suggest he believed he was engaging fleet carriers, not escort carriers, and feared air attacks from other American carrier groups. Others argue he was concerned about fuel reserves for the return voyage. Whatever his reasoning, the center force turned away. Taffy 3 survived. But the battle demonstrated something crucial about carrier aviation in 1944. Even small escort carriers could generate sufficient air power to threaten battleships if they could launch quickly enough and maintain continuous attacks. The implications for Essex-class carriers, with 4 times the aircraft capacity and far superior launch capabilities, were obvious. Had Task Force 38's Essex-class carriers been present off Samar instead of chasing Ozawa's decoy force to the north, Kurita's center force would have been destroyed long before reaching gun range. 15 Essex-class carriers could have launched over 1,000 aircraft within 20 minutes. No surface force, regardless of armor or firepower, could survive that weight of attack. This reality fundamentally changed naval warfare's strategic calculus. Battleships, which had dominated naval planning since the dreadnought era began in 1906, were obsolete. Not because battleships couldn't sink carriers in surface combat, they absolutely could. But because carriers could launch attacks from ranges where battleships couldn't respond, and could sustain those attacks at tempos battleship defenses couldn't contain. The Essex-class carriers proved this decisively. Their 7-minute launch capability meant they controlled engagement range. Their aircraft capacity meant they could maintain continuous attacks. Their industrial production meant losses could be replaced faster than combat destroyed them. Japan had never anticipated facing this combination. Japanese naval planning in the 1930s had assumed rough parity in carrier capabilities between major powers. Individual ship quality might vary, pilot skill might differ, tactical doctrine might create advantages, but the fundamental tempo of carrier operations was assumed to be similar across all navies. Essex-class carriers shattered this assumption. They didn't just perform the same operations faster, they performed operations Japanese carriers couldn't conduct at all, launching a full strike in 7 minutes, recovering it, rearming, and launching again within 90 minutes, created operational possibilities that Japanese doctrine had never considered. The production achievement was equally revolutionary. Kaiser Shipyard in Vancouver, Washington, built ships using prefabrication techniques developed for mass production. Major sections were constructed in specialized facilities, transported to the shipyard, and assembled like enormous building blocks. This approach meant multiple ships could be under construction simultaneously, with work proceeding in parallel rather than sequentially. Essex, the lead ship, required 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. Later ships took as little as 14 months. 24 Essex-class carriers were completed between December 1942 and April 1946. The last ships were commissioned after Japanese surrender, but their construction demonstrated American industrial capacity to sustain production at scales Japanese shipbuilding could never match. Japan completed 17 carriers of all types between December 1941 and August 1945. Most were converted from other hulls, rather than purpose-built fleet carriers. The numerical disparity was severe, but understated the real gap. An Essex-class carrier commissioned in 1944 represented more combat power than 3 or 4 earlier Japanese carriers combined. The compound effect of numerical and technological superiority meant American carrier forces were overmatching Japanese forces by wider margins as the war progressed. Every month saw more Essex-class carriers entering service, while Japanese carrier strength declined through combat losses that couldn't be replaced. By early 1945, the question was not whether American carrier forces could strike Japan itself, but how soon, and with what weight of attack. Task Force 58, the redesignated carrier force operating directly under 5th Fleet rather than 3rd Fleet, began strikes against the Japanese home islands in February 1945. The carriers operated with confidence that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. They approached within 100 miles of Tokyo, launched continuous strikes against airfields and industrial targets, and withdrew after completing missions with minimal losses. Japanese air defenses, though fierce, could not prevent the attacks or inflict casualties sufficient to stop American operations. The tempo of American carrier strikes accelerated through spring and summer 1945. Essex-class carriers conducted repeated raids against airfields, harbors, and industrial facilities across the Japanese home islands. Their 7-minute launch capability meant they could put hundreds of aircraft over targets in a single wave, overwhelming Japanese defenses through sheer numbers. Japanese response grew increasingly desperate. Kamikaze attacks intensified as conventional defense proved futile. But even kamikaze tactics couldn't overcome the mathematical reality of American carrier superiority. Essex-class carriers absorbed kamikaze hits that would have destroyed earlier carriers and remained operational, Their damage, control systems, redundant compartmentation, and robust construction meant they could sustain damage and continue fighting. USS Franklin suffered the worst attack any American carrier survived. On March 19, 1945, while operating 50 miles off the Japanese coast, Franklin was struck by two armor-piercing bombs, dropped by a single Japanese dive bomber that had penetrated the combat air patrol. The bombs detonated in the hangar deck among fueled and armed aircraft preparing for launch. The resulting explosions and fires killed 724 men and wounded 265. Franklin's entire aft section became an inferno. Aircraft loaded with bombs and rockets cooked off, hurling shrapnel across the hangar deck. Aviation gasoline fed fires that reached temperatures sufficient to melt steel. For 7 hours, the ship's survival remained uncertain. What saved Franklin was the damage control design built into every Essex-class carrier. Compartmentation limited flooding. Fire suppression systems slowed the spread of flames. Multiple redundant systems meant that even catastrophic damage to one section didn't cripple the entire ship. Franklin survived, was towed to safety, and eventually returned to the United States under her own power. The fact that an Essex-class carrier could absorb this level of damage and survive demonstrated the robust engineering that characterized the class. Japanese carriers struck by equivalent attacks invariably sank. The disparity wasn't primarily about courage or damage control skill, though American crews fought with extraordinary determination. It was about design philosophy. Essex-class carriers were built to absorb punishment and keep fighting. Japanese carriers were not. The war ended in August 1945 before Essex-class carriers could demonstrate their capabilities in the invasion of Japan that had been planned for November. But their impact on the war's outcome was decisive. They had given American forces the ability to project air power across the Pacific at scales and tempos that Japanese forces could never match. The 7-minute launch capability that Japanese admirals never expected became the standard against which all subsequent carrier operations were measured. Modern supercarriers launching far more sophisticated aircraft in far more complex environments still strive to match the operational tempo that Essex-class carriers achieved through systematic design and ruthless efficiency. The legacy of the Essex-class extended far beyond World War II. 9 carriers remained in active service through the 1970s. Several served in Korea and Vietnam. USS Lexington, the last operational Essex-class carrier, didn't retire until November 1991, nearly 50 years after the class design was finalized. This longevity testified to the fundamental soundness of the design and its adaptability to changing technologies. The men, who served aboard Essex-class carriers during World War II, understood they were operating revolutionary weapons systems. Flight deck crews, who launched 98 aircraft in 7 minutes, knew they were performing feats that seemed impossible by pre-war standards. Pilots who flew from these carriers recognized that the operational tempo they maintained would have been unsustainable from earlier carriers. What they perhaps didn't fully appreciate at the time was how completely Essex-class carriers had changed naval warfare's fundamental nature. The decisive battle that Japanese doctrine anticipated for decades occurred repeatedly throughout 1944 and 45. Japan lost every time, not because Japanese sailors lacked courage or skill, but because they were fighting with weapons systems designed for an earlier era against enemies who had redefined what naval warfare meant. The ability to launch 100 aircraft in 7 minutes wasn't just a technical achievement. It was the physical manifestation of American industrial philosophy applied to military operations. Mass production, standardization, continuous improvement, parallel processing. These concepts, developed in automobile factories and steel mills, transformed naval warfare when applied systematically to carrier design and operations. Japanese admirals who planned operations based on assumptions that carriers required 45 minutes to launch strikes were not stupid or incompetent. They were operating with calculations accurate for Japanese carriers and reasonable for pre-war American carriers. What they failed to anticipate was that American industrial culture would produce carriers fundamentally different from anything that had existed before. The Essex-class carriers were not just better than previous carriers. They were different kinds of machines, optimized for sustained high-tempo operations at industrial scale. They were designed to be built quickly, operated efficiently, and maintained continuously. They were weapons systems that assumed industrial warfare would be decided by production capacity and operational tempo, rather than individual excellence or tactical brilliance. This philosophy proved decisive. By October 1944, when Captain Baker stood on Lexington's bridge, watching his flight deck crew launch 98 aircraft in 7 minutes, American carrier aviation had achieved superiority so complete that Japanese forces could no longer contest American operations meaningfully. The question was not whether America would win, but how soon and at what cost. The 7-minute launch capability represented an American victory in miniature. Quick, efficient, overwhelming. Impossible to match by enemies who had entered the war, assuming that spirit and skill could overcome material disadvantages. The Essex-class carriers proved that assumption wrong with mathematical precision. Thank you for watching. For more detailed, historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.